Turn with me to page 155. And on the bottom of the page, after the series of asterisks that are there, Chesterton writes, "When men in books awake from a vision, they commonly find themselves in some place in which they might have fallen asleep. They yawn in a chair or lift themselves with bruised limbs from a field. Syme's experience was something much more psychologically strange, if there was indeed anything unreal in the earthly sense about the things he had gone through." How many of you were just crazy frustrated when you got to this point and realized that this was all a dream? What do we make of that? Well, there's really two different ways that I want us to explore the dream idea here. First of all is this perspective of what the dream allows Chesterton to do. And so I think throughout the book we find that there are certain elements of the story that are just slightly fantastical. Right? I mean, the size of Sunday from the very beginning is described as enormous. He's almost too big to be believed, and yet the characters keep coming back to this thought that he can just kind of barely be believed. So we're talking about a colossal of a man, almost too big to be human, and yet still possible to be understood as human. And so we have a lot of that throughout the story where we're just right on the cusp of being unbelievable to where we would go, this has to be a dream. And yet, we believe it. We believe it throughout that this is actually happening to Gabriel Syme. Riding an elephant, flying in a hot air balloon, again, fantastical, crazy, on the cusp of being unreal, and yet we can just understand the possibility of that being the case. And so I think we're led throughout the entire novel to have this kind of willful suspension of disbelief that we oftentimes have in movies, where we allow things that just seem a little bit too far out there to still be within the realm of possibility, to still be within the explanation of our own universe. Now, if we're in Harry Potter's universe, we don't have to willfully suspend disbelief in some ways, because the universe itself is built for that. We say this is how it could actually be. If we find ourselves in something like Narnia, we know that Narnia is a different world, and so the rules do not apply in the same way. But in this book, for all expectations, we're in our own world, we're in London, we expect things to go a certain way, and yet at the end he wakes up from a dream. And so I think that the dream provides us with that opportunity that all throughout, Chesterton can balance on the edge of the unbelievable while still keeping us within our own world, within our own expectations, within our own understanding of things. But what that does is the moment that he reveals that this was all a dream is I think it sets a new interpretive framework on this book. We're not reading this as even so much just a fictional story. We're certainly not reading it as an historical account. We're reading it now in terms of a dream, and dreams in our mind are symbolic. All of us think about the interpretation of dreams. We think about dreams as being metaphorical or symbolic in ways that point to something else. And so the moment that Syme, on the last page, wakes up from this experience and we learn that it was a dream, it changes everything about how we interpret this story. And I think that's exactly what Chesterton means for us to do, is to reinterpret our expectations based on the realization that this is a dream. And in light of those expectations, now to go back through that story, to reread that story, and to look at the symbolic meaning that happens throughout. Now, I hope you do find the time to read this. The very first time I read this book, I immediately started from the beginning and started reading it straight through again. I could not believe that I had been so duped about the dream, and I just thought it was so unfair of Chesterton after this lengthy story to reveal, not lengthy in terms of the novel, but as far as the amount of events that are happening in this 150 pages, to put me in this situation where all of a sudden it's revealed to be a dream. So I began rereading this book, and this is really the second part that I want to point out, and then in subsequent lectures we'll actually explore some of the meanings of this. But what I began to realize immediately is that I just wasn't a careful enough reader. And maybe some of you picked up on this. I did not, like I said, the first time I read this, I did not pick up on this. But Chesterton actually hints, and maybe not even hints, just flat out tells us over and over again throughout this book that we're in the midst of a dream. First of all, there's some hints if you actually turn to the title page where it tells you The Man Who Is Thursday, a Nightmare. Many editions have that on the front cover. This one doesn't have that on the front cover, but it does on the title page, is that it's called The Man Who Is Thursday, a Nightmare. Now, of course, we can understand nightmare as just a really scary tale, a bad situation or occurrence that happens, but certainly nightmare can put us into the idea that this is a dream. If you go back and again, grab your books and start flipping through this with me, but go to page 1, and then I'm going to read these off pretty quickly, and then you can go back through and re-listen to this and actually track down some of these on your own, maybe even highlight them. But on page 1, he says, "The place was not only pleasant, but perfect, if once he could regard it not as a deception, but rather as a dream." And so on the very first page of the book, he uses the word dream and introduces that idea into our head. On page 7, I think, is a really important passage related to the dream. And it says, halfway down the page, he stared and talked at the girl's red hair and amused face for what seemed to be a few minutes, and then, feeling that groups in such a place should mix, rose to his feet. To his astonishment, he discovered the whole garden empty. Everyone had gone long ago, and he went himself with a rather hurried apology. And I'm going to pause there because already we're getting a sense that Syme feels as though just a moment has passed, and yet, to his astonishment, everyone else is gone. The garden's completely empty, and it says that they had gone long ago. So there's a significant passage of time here, and as it says in the very next line, he left with a sense of champagne in his head, which he could not afterwards explain. And so there may be something here in which this sense of champagne in his head is kind of the deliriousness that comes with the fact that he's actually entered into the dream, maybe from the actual beginning of the story. And so there's some fun debates that I like to have in class here, that you could have with one another as well. When does the dream begin? Does it begin before we even start the book, or maybe it starts somewhere here when he actually is sitting in the garden talking at the girl's red hair and then wakes? And there's a little bit more evidence for that in just a moment. It says, "In the wild events which were to follow, this girl had no part at all. He never saw her again until all his tale was over. And yet in some indescribable way she kept recurring like a motive in music through all his mad adventures afterwards, and the glory of her strange hair ran like a red thread through those dark and ill-drawn tapestries of the night. For what followed was so improbable that it might well have been a dream." And of course, when we get to the end of the book and find out it was a dream and come back through and reread this, we realize that Chesterton told us that that's exactly what was happening. But I think this idea that as he kind of loses consciousness, or loses awareness at least, while staring at and talking at the girl's red hair, he then says that this red hair is like a thread through these dark and ill-drawn tapestries of the night. It recurs like a motive in music. And so in some ways, you can almost talk about like tying a bow around it. You can have this idea that her hair is actually the thread that holds all of these anecdotes, all of these stories together. All of the rest of these occasions and occurrences in Syme's experience are actually all part of a dream that begin with Rosamund's red hair. And if you remember at the very end of the book, it tells us once again that he sees Rosamund there with the great unconscious gravity of a girl. And so Rosamund at the beginning and the end in some ways bracket what may be the occasion of the dream here. Well, I'm going to start moving a little bit faster, or a lot faster. On page 9, we have a couple of these occurrences, actually, in which it says at the bottom of the page, if you will consent to burden your soul with a vow that you should never make and a knowledge you should never dream about, I will promise you in return. So here, we're using dream in the sense of you would never think about doing such a thing. But the fact that he uses the word dream is just another occasion where he's hinting at some of these ideas. And if you turn over to page 12, it's one of my favorite passages in the entire book, in light of the revelation that this is a dream. And at the top of the page, he says, "Excuse me if I join myself rather obviously," he said to Gregory, smiling. "I don't often have the luck to have a dream like this. It is new for me for a nightmare to lead to a lobster. It is commonly the other way." And so, of course, both dream and nightmare here are hinting at this. But here's what I find so fascinating, is that Syme is telling Gregory, I don't often have the luck to have a dream like this. So Syme is hinting at the idea that he's in a dream, maybe facetiously here. But Gregory then says, "You are not asleep, I assure you." But of course, what's so fascinating about that is Gregory represents the Satan figure at the very end of the novel. And so here, perhaps if we're listening carefully to Syme, we've been hinted at that this is a dream, and yet it's actually the Satan character that leads us astray, and we believe him when he assures us that he is not asleep. And so, again, as he goes on, he talks a little bit on that page about in a few moments, this table will begin to turn around a little. Don't put it down to your inroads into the champagne. So there's some parallels here with that sense of champagne in his head on page 7. But let's skip a little bit further. There's some others in here, but we're going to skip to page 40, and I'm just going to start quickly naming some of these off. On page 40, and there was the last nightmare touch that his smile suddenly went wrong. You can go to page 55, and when Syme saw it laying on the table, he woke up again to the world outside him. You can see this kind of similar language that's happening throughout. Page 62, Syme remembering all the nightmares he had ever known. Page 64, will you see that the nightmare sits on your grave at the bottom of the page on 64. On page 70, he says, their special poise and position made one block of buildings especially look like a Tower of Babel with 100 eyes. Syme had never seen any of the skyscraping buildings in America, so he could only think of the buildings in a dream. Page 77 is another one. He says, I dreamt of that alphabet of yours. Page 94 and 95, more about dreams. On page 94, when the jar of the joined iron ran up Syme's arm, all the fantastic fears that have been the subject of this story fell from him like dreams from a man waking up in bed. Page 95, he felt like a man who had dreamed all night of falling over precipices. Page 106, he says, as a man in an evil dream strains himself to scream and wake, Syme strove with a sudden effort to fling off this last and worst of his fancies. Page 119, he says, I think, said Dr. Bull with precision, that I am lying in bed at number 217 Peabody Buildings, and that I shall soon wake up. Page 145. The hedges were ordinary hedges, the trees seemed ordinary trees, yet he felt like a man entrapped in fairyland. And then on the next page, 146, Syme under the influence of the same mesmeric sleep of amazement. Page 148, he found that he had to wear a sword. It stirred a boyish dream. Page 152, then Sunday spoke, but so dreamily that he might have been continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. Page 153, it talks about Bull going to sleep. And then on page 154, and there came a day, murmured Bull, who seemed really to have fallen asleep, when the sons of God came before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. Page 155 is when he awakes then from a vision and speaks once again of having fallen asleep. And even in the midst of that, we have some similar language that helps us out on page 107, for instance, where it tells us that he was like some allegoric figure of labor frescoed on a ground of gold. And then again on page 116, there was a certain allegory of their whole position in the contrast between the modern automobile and its strange ecclesiastical lamp. And so there are just dozens of occasions in which Chesterton uses specifically the language of dream, nightmare, waking up, or similar language of dreams to draw our attention to that topic. And yet from the very beginning, the combination of Gregory's statement to say, I assure you that you are awake, as well as I think the fact that as crazy as things get, they're always on the borderline of the believable. We would expect in a true dream that something might be completely outside the realm of possibility. For instance, if the elephant began to fly like the hot air balloon, we would know that we had moved into a dream or a fantasy land. But for him to ride on the elephant across town and for him to fly on the hot air balloon, with all of the insanity that goes along with that, we can just believe it to be the case. And so I think Chesterton does something really beautiful here, in which he tells us throughout the entire book by his language that we should know that we're in a dream. And yet when he reveals it at the end, I think most readers find themselves, even if they anticipated it a little bit, shocked by the reality that that is the answer to Syme's experiences. Now, that doesn't answer, however, the meaning of those experiences, but it does alert us to the fact, because it is a dream, that we need to revisit the events that happen and begin looking at them in a more allegorical light, in a more symbolic or metaphorical light. And that's what we're going to do in subsequent lectures.